Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Polk and the focus is military success. The year is 1846. Congress has just declared war against Mexico, granting President Polk his request for that war. And while General Zachary Taylor is starting to rack up one victory after another in Palo Alto, the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, and then crossing over the Rio Grande to take the fight directly to the Mexicans on Mexican soil, James Polk was strategizing. He was organizing, getting ready for the broader picture of the campaign. For the military side, he was planning to lean on Major General Winfield Scott, who had been running the American military for most of the last 3 decades, but he was appalled when Scott came back and said it would take him 4 months before he'd be ready to take his troops into the field. Polk thought this was a ridiculously long amount of time. Scott, who was a very prickly sort himself, was indignant over the micromanagement that was coming from his commander-in-chief. So how did they work it out? Scott was benched. He said, look, Polk said, you're not going to the battle. You're going to stay here in Washington, D.C. We'll figure something else out. Part of figuring that out was fair game of all Mexican territory. This wasn't just about the border dispute in the southern tip of Texas. As far as Polk was concerned, shots had been fired and all of Mexico was now fair game. That included the desirable territories of New Mexico and California. And for this, he set his army in motion. Secretary of War William Marcy delivered orders to Colonel Stephen Kearney, who was the commander at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, to go take these territories. He rallied his troops and he did just that. He showed up in Santa Fe and the Mexicans basically retreated and abandoned the town. And so he garrisoned all of this territory for the United States before heading off to California. By the time he got there, much of California was already in American hands. Commodore Robert Stockton and his troops had basically already taken the Los Angeles area. He then went north to join up with Major John Fremont, where they captured the military establishments in the area of Monterrey, California. Effectively, these territories were now already in American hands just at the very beginning of the war, exactly what James Polk had been hoping for. These were pretty easy pickings, and he certainly had no intention of ever giving this land back. Well, there was one flaw, only really one major flaw in terms of the strategy for President Polk. He thought that he could deal with the former president and general of Mexico, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who is currently living in exile in the Caribbean. He thought with a nice offer of cash, he could get peace, he could get the land he was looking for, and he sent an emissary to go talk to Santa Anna. And Santa Anna was intrigued, he was interested. And so what Polk decided was to let Santa Anna back into Mexico. He had his blockade of the eastern portion of the country to stand down, let Santa Anna's ship come through, and in September of 1846, Santa Anna arrived in Mexico City. But he all of a sudden had a precondition. Before he would negotiate with the Americans, they had to leave Mexican soil. He was not going to negotiate with soldiers who were taking the fight on his land. Well, this was a non-starter as far as the Americans were concerned. And so Santa Anna then turned around and said, look, if you're not going to negotiate with me, I'm going to take the war to you. And he was ready to get back into his general's uniform and lead Mexican troops. He told the Mexican people, Mexicans, there was once a day and my heart dilates with the remembrance. You saluted me with the title of soldier of the people. Allow me to take it again, never more to be given up, and to devote myself until death to the defense of the liberty and independence of the Republic. This is what happened. He started to build up an army to take the fight to Zachary Taylor in northern Mexico. Well, James Polk was increasingly convinced that that was not going to be the way to win this war. From the northern area that Taylor was currently had his troops to come try to potentially come all the way down to Mexico City. That was going to be a very difficult task given the terrain and the people that were in his way. He kept thinking that maybe there was another route, but that he was going to have to go to Mexico City to win this war. There was only one person, as always, in his cabinet who disagreed. That was James Buchanan, Secretary of State. He said to go into Mexico City was not necessary. Polk pushes his concerns aside and said, that's where we're going to go. But he also decided to contemplate another change. There was a problem going on with General Zachary Taylor, at least in the minds of James Polk. As Taylor started racking up those victories, he started to get a lot of press. And the Whigs, the opposition political party, started talking about Taylor as a potential presidential candidate, even though he had expressed no political opinions ever in his entire career, and he basically said, I'm not interested in being president. That's what the press was talking about. Polk was also really upset at Taylor for what happened after the Battle of Monterrey, Mexico. He allowed General Pedro de Ampudia to walk away after his surrender, and he actually agreed to an 8-week armistice. Now, there were reasons why Taylor did this. He felt they were exactly the right things to do in the grand scheme of things, but Polk was outraged. He thought this was about beating the enemy, not letting him walk away. So Polk was losing faith in Taylor. He wrote in his diary that Taylor is evidently a weak man and has been made giddy with the idea of the presidency. He is most ungrateful, for I have promoted him, as I now think, beyond his deserts, and without reference to his politics. I am now satisfied that he is a narrow-minded, bigoted partisan without resource and wholly unqualified for the command he holds. He decided to turn back to Winfield Scott to put him once again in charge. Scott was ecstatic. All he wanted was to get back in the good graces, so it was good enough to go into the war zone and lead troops. And the decision was made that Scott would attack from the east, land at the fortress town of Veracruz, take that fortress, and run through the 250 miles directly west to Mexico City. To do that, he was going to take most of the officers and best troops from Zachary Taylor. They were going to be realigned to the Eastern Theater, and Taylor was going to be left with a small force, basically just a defensive force. Well, Taylor was appalled. He was beside himself at this. He thought it was a political move. He took it personally. He wrote some letters that got into the press that caused all kinds of concern with the administration. And he eventually decided to take a little military action as well. He took his troops out from behind their defenses near Monterrey and eventually came face to face with Santa Anna in the mountains near Buena Vista. Now, Santa Anna had a lot more men than Taylor did. But Taylor had the better land, the better terrain, and also the better artillery, and eventually Taylor won that battle. Santa Anna left the field to go fight against General Scott on the Eastern Theater, and Zachary Taylor left the field as well. He asked for a leave of absence. This was the last battle he would fight in his military uniform. He was disgusted with what was happening back in Washington, D.C., and the next political battle he would fight, or his next battle he would fight, would be a political one, and that would come in the presidential election of 1848. So Scott's now the man in charge. Now, he again was always a difficult person as well. Very high ego, a prickly one, always took his own counsel, hated the fact of anybody trying to micromanage him. But if you look at his Mexican campaign of 1847, there were no faults there. He was nearly flawless. He began with the siege at the fortress of Veracruz. 20 days later, the Mexicans capitulated. It was a brilliant success to start on the path of one victory after another. He had 8,500 men with him, 250 miles to cover. Santa Anna was in his way at multiple steps, but Scott beat him at every turn. Battles at Cerro Gordo, Contreras, Churubusco, all the way to the gates of Mexico City when the Mexicans finally asked for an armistice. Scott granted it, but it didn't last. He thought that the Mexicans were going against the terms of the armistice. He re-engaged. Then the big battle, the last bastion of defense for the Mexicans, was the castle at Chapultepec. Scott and his men captured that. By the time they got past that into Mexico City, Santa Anna had left the city with his troops, and Scott and his men simply walked in, and the fighting of the Mexican-American War was essentially over. Polk's military had executed his vision to perfection. California, New Mexico, the southern Texas border area, northern Mexico, all the way from Veracruz to Mexico City, one victory after another. But now it's time to negotiate. How did the whole thing come to an end? And the politics to finish this task were not going to be easy. And there would be long-term implications of the results. But those are stories for another day. That is James Polk and military success from the life of James Polk. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.